In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave. He was not looking for anything. He was a teenager, tending goats on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea in one of the most desolate stretches of land on Earth. The rock clattered against something inside the cave, something that should not have been there. He climbed in to investigate, and what he found inside that cave would detonate through the world of biblical scholarship like nothing before or since. Clay jars, sealed, ancient, and inside them, wrapped in linen, scrolls. Not one cave, eventually 11 caves. Not one set of scrolls, eventually nearly 1,000 separate manuscripts, some intact, some in thousands of fragments, some reduced to scraps no larger than a postage stamp. The oldest dated to the 3rd century before Christ. Some were even older. They had been sitting in those caves, perfectly preserved by the dry desert air, for more than 2,000 years. The world was told they were discovered. What the world was not fully told, not for decades, was what they contained. And that is where the investigation begins. Let's establish what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are, because the official story and the complete story are not quite the same thing. The scrolls were found near the ancient site of Qumran, where a Jewish sect called the Essenes had established a community sometime around the 2nd century before Christ. The Essenes were not mainstream Jews. They were separatists, a group who believed the Jerusalem priesthood had become corrupted, that the temple had been defiled, and that God's true people needed to withdraw from the compromised religious establishment and prepare themselves for the coming end of the age. They were, in the most precise sense of the word, an apocalyptic community. They believed they were living in the last days. They believed a great war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness was coming. And they copied and preserved texts, sacred texts, prophetic texts, texts that the religious establishment in Jerusalem would not have sanctioned, because they believed those texts mattered for what was ahead. When the Romans came in 70 AD and destroyed Jerusalem, someone at Qumran made a decision. They took their library, hundreds of manuscripts representing centuries of careful preservation, sealed them in clay jars, hid them in the caves above the settlement, and disappeared. Whether they intended to return for them or whether they knew they would not, we cannot say. What we know is that those jars sat undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for a shepherd boy and a rock. Now here is where the investigation gets serious, because what happened after the discovery is a story that took 50 years to fully come to light, and it raises questions that have never been fully answered. The scrolls were acquired in fragments by different parties almost immediately. Some went to the Hebrew University. Some were purchased by an American archaeologist. A significant collection ended up under the control of a small team of international scholars assembled by the Jordanian government and the École Biblique, a French Catholic institution in Jerusalem. This team was given exclusive access to the largest and most significant collection of scroll fragments. They were the gatekeepers, and they did not publish. For decades, the most important unpublished fragments sat in a room in Jerusalem, accessible only to a handful of scholars who controlled all access and who released information at a pace that can only be described as extremely slow. Other researchers who requested access were denied. Photographs that had been taken of the fragments were locked away. The scholarly community grew increasingly frustrated. Critics began asking the obvious question: what was in those fragments that made the gatekeepers so reluctant to let anyone else see them? It was not until 1991, 44 years after the initial discovery, that the logjam broke. The Huntington Library in California, which held a complete set of photographs of the unpublished fragments, announced it would make them available to any qualified researcher. The monopoly collapsed, the fragments were published, and scholars finally got to see what had been sitting in that room. What they found did not destroy the Bible. Let that be said clearly. The people who had been hoping the scrolls contained explosive evidence against Christianity or Judaism were disappointed. What the scrolls contained was in many ways far more significant than a scandal. They contained confirmation, deep, layered, manuscript-level confirmation of things the people of God had believed and preserved for centuries. And they contained prophetic material that should make every serious student of Scripture stop and pay attention. Here is what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually revealed. Not the sensational version, the real one. First, the biblical text itself. Among the scrolls was a complete copy of the book of Isaiah, the great Isaiah scroll, dating to approximately 125 BC, making it the oldest complete manuscript of any biblical book ever found. More than 1,000 years older than the previously oldest known copy. When scholars compared it to the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible that modern translations are based on, they found it was, with only minor variations, essentially identical. 1,000 years of hand copying across 1,000 years of history, and the text had been preserved with extraordinary fidelity. The people who had been telling you the Bible had been changed and corrupted over the centuries had a problem. The evidence did not support them. Second, the sectarian documents. The Essenes were not merely copying existing texts, they were writing their own. Commentaries, rule books, hymns, and most significantly, interpretations of prophecy. The document called the Pesher Habakkuk is a running commentary on the book of Habakkuk, applying its ancient prophecies to events the Essenes were living through in their own time. The document, called the War Scroll, describes in vivid detail the final battle between the forces of God and the forces of darkness. A 40-year war organized into specific phases, complete with military formations, battle standards, and the role of the heavenly host. The people at Qumran were not casual believers. They were students of prophecy who believed the end was near and who organized their entire community around that conviction. Third, and most remarkable, the Messianic texts. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become genuinely astonishing for anyone who takes Scripture seriously. Among the fragments is a text known as 4Q521, the Messianic Apocalypse. It describes the coming Messiah in language that is almost verbatim identical to what Jesus said about himself in Luke 7, when John the Baptist sent messengers to ask if Jesus was the one who was to come. Jesus replied, "Go tell John what you see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them." That list. That specific list. It appears in a Dead Sea Scroll written more than a century before Jesus was born. The Essenes were expecting a Messiah who would do exactly what Jesus did. The description was already written down. The expectation was already in place. And then Jesus came and fulfilled it, not because he knew the scroll, but because the scroll knew him. There is another document that demands attention. The Temple Scroll, the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls at nearly 30 feet, describes a vision of an idealized temple, a city, and a covenant community organized according to divine law. It reads in places as though God himself is speaking in the first person, giving instructions for how his dwelling place among his people should be constructed and ordered. Scholars debate its precise origins and authority, but what strikes any careful reader is the orientation of the entire document. It is pointed forward. It is not describing the past. It is describing what is coming. A temple not built by human hands, a city whose builder and maker is God, a covenant that will not be broken. The people of Qumran were waiting for something. They had withdrawn from the corrupted present because they believed the real thing was still ahead, and they preserved their texts in sealed jars in desert caves because they believed someone, someday, would need to read them. They were right. Here is what should disturb you in the best possible way. about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls were written by people who were not part of mainstream Judaism. They were not part of the temple establishment. They were not among the Pharisees or Sadducees whose debates fill the pages of the New Testament. They were outsiders, a community in the desert, separated from the centers of religious power, convinced that the official version of their faith had drifted from the truth. And yet, it was these outsiders who preserved the texts. It was these outsiders who maintained the calendar, studied the prophecies, and kept the expectation of the Messiah alive with a precision that the insiders had lost. And when the Messiah came, he came to the outsiders first. It began with a carpenter and a teenage girl in Galilee, to shepherds in a field outside Bethlehem, to fishermen on a lake, to tax collectors and sinners and lepers and the kind of people the religious establishment had long since written off. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not just a manuscript discovery. They are a window into a world that was watching and waiting, a world that had held the thread of prophecy carefully, in the dark, in the desert, in sealed jars hidden in caves, because it believed the promises of God were worth protecting. And that thread leads directly to a manger, to a cross, to an empty tomb, and forward. According to those same scrolls, according to those same prophecies, according to the same God who preserved the text through 1,000 years of hand copying and 2,000 years of desert silence, to something that has not yet happened, but is coming. The jars are open, the scrolls have been read, the evidence is in. The question is whether you are paying attention.